Under the pouring rain, Alexander Grant knelt in the middle of the villa's courtyard, his white shirt soaked with water, his trembling hands clutching a bloody teddy bear. His eyes were red. His lips mumbled something as if begging for forgiveness from someone who was no longer there. Thunder sounded. The ambulance's headlights reflected on his pained face. The man who was once respected by the whole city was now left with only emptiness and regret. The voice of the narrator echoed as soft as a breath. He had everything, but lost the only thing that could warm his heart. The screen faded, time rewinding a few months ago when a young girl entered the grand gate of the Grant villa. Amara stood there, drenched from head to toe, clutching her old handbag. She only had a letter of introduction and a faint hope of a maid job in the most luxurious house in the suburbs. The butler looked at her with cold eyes, asking in a stern voice if she had experience. Amara nodded slightly, whispering that she had been a babysitter, a cook, and a housekeeper. She was led into Alexander's office. He sat in a large office, the light reflecting off the frosted glass. His eyes were sharp, his voice short and decisive, telling her that she only had a 3-day trial. Amara bowed her head, thanked him, and took the room key. That night she lay on the small bed in the basement room, listening to the rain falling outside the window. Her heart filled with worry and determination. She knew that if she couldn't keep this job, her brother wouldn't have money to buy her medicine. The next morning, Amara woke up early. She prepared breakfast, cleaned the hall, and tried to do everything perfectly. When she brought tea into the living room, she saw little Ethan sitting quietly on the sofa, his eyes looking far away. He looked about 8 years old, his face handsome but sad like an old painting. She smiled slightly and asked softly, "Do you want milk or orange juice?" The boy didn't answer. The housekeeper shook her head slightly, signaling her to stop, and whispered that Ethan hadn't spoken to anyone since his mother died. Amara fell silent, put down her glass of milk and backed away. But as she turned away, the boy gently tugged on her shirt. Amara turned back, saw that look in her eyes, the look of a child who wanted to believe again. She smiled, nodded, and said softly, "It's okay. You don't have to talk, just smile." And surprisingly, the boy's lips curved up slightly. A smile for the first time in months. The housekeeper was stunned, and Amara stood still, her heart trembling with emotion. In the study above, Alexander happened to see the scene through the glass. He found his expression unreadable. He called the housekeeper up to ask about the new girl, his voice full of suspicion. "Who is she?" "Why is my son smiling?" The housekeeper replied that the boy only smiled when the maid spoke. Alexander did not answer, just silently looked out the window where the first sunlight after the rain shone on the garden. The next day, Amara diligently cleaned, helped Ethan draw, and read stories. The boy gradually clung to her, always coming to her when he was sad. Alexander saw the change in his son, but he did not show it. One evening, during the meal, Ethan accidentally spilled a glass of water. The butler panicked and wanted to scold the boy, but Amara quickly wiped it away and said, "It's okay, everyone is clumsy sometimes." Alexander looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in many years, he heard a gentle voice in the otherwise silent house. After the meal, he walked out onto the porch and saw Amara teaching Ethan to fold paper cranes. The boy giggled when a small crane landed on his shoulder. Alexander smiled slightly, but only for a moment. He told himself not to let strangers into the world of father and son. That night he sat in his study, opening the old box containing the photos of his deceased wife. He quietly whispered, "I can't let anyone replace you." Meanwhile, Amara stayed up late mending Ethan's torn shirt. The yellow light shone on her face, her eyes filled with a gentleness that she herself didn't realize. The next morning, Ethan woke up to find the paper crane on the table next to a small piece of paper with the words, "Every smile is a little miracle." The boy brought it to his father. Alexander read it and was speechless. That night, when he passed the living room, he saw Amara sitting and telling Ethan a fairy tale. The story was about a poor girl who saved a lost child in the middle of a rainy night. Ethan fell asleep in her arms, a smile still on his lips. Alexander looked at them, his eyes softening, but he quickly turned away. He was afraid that he would feel something long dead in his heart again. The next day, the butler whispered that some employees were gossiping about Amara's past. Alexander coldly told her to ignore it, but he began to wonder. He called his old secretary and learned about the girl. Meanwhile, Amara still took care of Ethan, teaching him to write his first words. When he wrote Dad and pointed at Alexander, she smiled brightly. Alexander was silent, his heart clenched, not knowing whether from happiness or fear. At night he walked to his son's room door, looked through the crack of the door and saw Amara singing a lullaby. Her voice was fragile but warm, as if touching the loneliness inside him. When she left the room, Alexander asked, "Why do you do all this?" Amara bowed her head. "Because I believe every child deserves to smile." He did not answer, just turned away. In his eyes, something had just awakened after being buried for many years. Morning came quietly over the grand mansion. The soft light poured through the curtains, casting pale gold across the marble floors. Amara moved silently through the hallway, her hands full of fresh linens, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She paused at the door of Ethan's room and smiled. The boy was already awake, crouched on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper and colored pencils. When he noticed her, he held up a drawing. It was a picture of 3 people, Ethan, Amara, and Alexander, standing under a bright sun. The man in the drawing, tall and proud, wore a smile that looked almost real. "That's your father?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, his small finger tracing the curve of the smile. Her chest warmed. "You drew him happy," she whispered, brushing his hair gently. For the first time, the mansion felt alive again. Downstairs, Alexander was sitting in his office, lost in thought. The past few weeks had been filled with moments he couldn't explain, his son laughing again, his home echoing with gentle voices, the strange calmness Amara brought with her presence. Yet part of him resisted it. He feared that warmth. He feared losing control. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His assistant entered with a folder. "You asked me to look into the new maid," the man said hesitantly. Alexander frowned, hesitating for a brief second before nodding. "Yes. What did you find?" The assistant hesitated. "Her full name is Amara Lewis. She used to work at Winston Textiles, the company your firm acquired 5 years ago. Her father was one of the workers affected when the plant closed. He didn't make it through the layoffs." Alexander's hand tightened on the desk. "What do you mean? He took his life a few months later, sir." The words dropped like stones into a still pond. Alexander sat back, his face unreadable. For a moment he couldn't breathe. All this time he thought fate had sent this woman to heal his home. But what if she came to destroy it? The thought crept into him like poison. That night he walked through the house, unable to rest. When he passed by the living room, he saw Amara kneeling beside Ethan, helping him sound out simple words from a storybook. Her voice was soft, full of patience. The boy giggled when he got a word right, and she clapped quietly for him. Alexander's throat tightened. He wanted to believe in her, but old wounds whispered distrust in his ear. The next morning he called her to his office. She came in nervously, hands clasped in front of her. "You wanted to see me, sir?" He studied her in silence, his eyes cold again. "Why didn't you tell me where you used to work?" Amara blinked, confused. I didn't think it was important, sir. It was years ago." His jaw clenched. "It was important to your father, wasn't it?" Her breath caught. The room seemed to shrink. "How do you know about my father?" "I know everything I need to," he said sharply. "You came here to take revenge. You used my son to get close to me." Her lips trembled, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "No, Mr. Grant, please. That's not true. I didn't even know enough." His voice cut like glass. "Pack your things. Leave before sunset." She tried to speak again, but he turned away, dismissing her with silence colder than any words. She walked out, eyes blurred with tears. Outside, the household staff watched quietly, some whispering. Only Ethan's small voice broke the stillness. He ran down the hall, clutching a toy car, calling her name. Amara. It was the first clear word he had spoken in years. Everyone froze. Amara stopped in the doorway, her heart twisting. She turned, knelt, and held the boy tight. "You did it," she whispered through tears. "You spoke." The child clung to her, sobbing, his little hands gripping her shirt. Alexander appeared behind them, stunned. He wanted to reach for his son, but guilt and pride chained his feet. Amara pulled away, gently brushing Ethan's hair. "You have to be brave now, okay? Be good to your father." She kissed his forehead and stood. Her suitcase felt heavier than it should. Without another glance, she walked out into the rain. The door closed with a hollow echo that lingered long after she was gone. That night, silence swallowed the mansion again. Ethan refused to eat. He sat by the window, hugging the paper crane Amara had folded for him, his eyes empty. Alexander tried to speak, but the boy turned away. Guilt gnawed at him until he couldn't stand it. He walked into Amara's empty room. It still smelled faintly of lavender and rain. On the nightstand lay a worn photograph of a young girl with her father, both smiling under the sunlight. The sight made his chest tighten. For the first time, he saw her not as a stranger, but as a person carrying her own pain. Outside, the wind howled and the rain started again. Hours passed before he realized the house had gone too quiet. Panic rose when he opened Ethan's room and found the bed empty. The window was open, curtains blowing wildly. "Ethan," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. He ran down the stairs, calling his son's name again and again. The gate was open, footprints visible in the mud. Without thinking, he grabbed his car keys and drove into the storm. Headlights cut through sheets of rain as he searched the roads. His heart pounded in terror, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. Then far ahead he saw a small figure walking along the roadside. Ethan, soaked to the skin, clutching the crane, crying as he stumbled toward the bus stop. Alexander's breath caught. He slammed the brakes and jumped out, shouting, "Ethan, stop!" The boy turned, startled. In that split second, a truck horn blared from the opposite lane. Everything happened too fast. The blinding lights, the screech of metal, the world spinning in chaos. When the noise faded, Alexander was kneeling in the mud, cradling his unconscious son. "Please, stay with me," he begged, his voice breaking. The truck driver shouted for help, but over the wind came another voice. "Mr. Grant." He turned and saw Amara running toward him through the storm, her clothes drenched, her face pale with fear. She had been at the bus stop when the crash happened. Without hesitation, she knelt beside them, checking Ethan's pulse. "He's breathing, but it's weak," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to get him to the hospital now." Alexander lifted his son and carried him to the car. Amara climbed in beside him, holding Ethan's small hand, whispering soft words. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. Stay awake for me." The car raced through the flooded streets, lightning flashing above. Amara pressed her hand against Ethan's chest, keeping pressure on a wound, ignoring the blood seeping through her sleeve. Alexander glanced at her, guilt and admiration mixing painfully in his heart. "Why did you come back?" he asked over the sound of the storm. Her eyes met his. "Because he needed me," she said simply. "I never wanted revenge, Mr. Grant. I just wanted to help your son smile again." Her voice cracked, but her hands never stopped shaking from cold and fear. A sharp turn threw the car into a puddle glass, shattering across the seat. Amara shielded the child with her body. Shards cut her arm and cheek, but she didn't flinch. "Hold on, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're almost there." When they finally reached the hospital, nurses rushed to take the boy. Alexander followed, shouting for help. Amara staggered out of the car, her knees giving way, blood dripping from her hands. She fainted just as the doctors disappeared into the emergency room. Alexander caught her before she hit the ground. "Stay with me, Amara," he whispered, his voice raw. She opened her eyes weakly. "He's going to be okay, right?" He nodded, though his throat was too tight to speak. "Because of you, he will be," he managed to say. They carried her inside, and for hours Alexander waited between two rooms, torn between fear and remorse. Every minute felt like an eternity. He replayed every word he had said to her, every cold look, every doubt. He realized that in his fear of being hurt, he had become the very thing that destroyed everything good around him. Near dawn, a doctor appeared. "Your son is stable," he said gently. "He'll need rest, but he'll recover." Relief broke through Alexander's chest, and for a moment he couldn't move. "And the woman?" he asked hoarsely. "She lost a lot of blood, but she's out of danger." Alexander walked to her room slowly, like a man approaching confession. Amara was lying pale under the white sheets, an ivy line running to her arm. Her face was bruised, but peaceful. He sat beside her, his voice barely a whisper. "I was wrong about you. I thought you came here to hurt us, but you were the only one trying to heal us." His fingers brushed a lock of hair from her face. "You saved my son. You saved me." Tears slipped down his cheeks, the first he had shed in years. He stayed by her side through the night, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. When the first light of morning crept through the blinds, Amara stirred. She opened her eyes and saw him there, his head resting on his folded arms beside her bed. "Mr. Grant," she whispered. He lifted his head, his eyes red from exhaustion. "You're awake," he said softly. "Ethan's safe." A weak smile touched her lips. Then it was worth everything. Her hand brushed his. The warmth of that simple touch filled the room with quiet grace. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "Rest now. When you wake, I'll make sure you never have to worry again." She tried to speak, but he shook his head. No words, just rest. Outside, the storm had passed. The clouds were clearing, and golden light began to pour through the window, washing away the night's fear. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something pure and steady inside him, a sense of peace he thought he would never feel again. He looked at her and whispered, "You brought the sun back to this house." And for a long moment, the world was silent except for the soft beeping of machines and the quiet beating of two hearts that had finally found forgiveness. Days passed before Amara was strong enough to leave the hospital bed. The air outside smelled of rain and new beginnings. Alexander had visited every morning, sitting quietly beside her, sometimes speaking, sometimes just watching her breathe. There was a gentleness in him now that no one in the mansion had ever seen. When she was finally discharged, he insisted on driving her home himself. As the car moved along the familiar road, Amara stared out of the window, her reflection shimmering in the glass. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I can take the bus." Alexander glanced at her, his voice calm. "It's not just a ride, it's an apology." She looked at him but said nothing. The mansion appeared over the hill surrounded by tall trees, still wet from the storm. When the gates opened, she hesitated, her hands tightening on her bag. "You don't have to go back in," she whispered. "I was never meant to stay." He turned off the engine, his expression steady but filled with quiet regret. "You were meant to. You brought life back into that house. Into me." His voice faltered slightly. "If you walk away now, you'll leave it as empty as it was before." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Amara stepped out of the car. The scent of wet earth filled the air. Inside, the staff greeted her with surprise and shy smiles. Ethan came running from the hallway, his small arms outstretched. "Amara," he cried, his voice clear and bright. She knelt, tears filling her eyes as he threw himself into her embrace. "You're okay," she whispered, holding him tightly. Alexander stood behind them, his heart swelling at the sound of his son's laughter echoing through the halls. That night the mansion was lit with warmth. Ethan insisted on sitting between them during dinner. For the first time since his wife's passing, Alexander found himself laughing softly, awkwardly, but genuinely. When Ethan fell asleep in Amara's lap later that evening, Alexander looked at her across the dimly lit room. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You already have," she replied. "You gave him back his father." He nodded, lowering his gaze. "I gave him my time, but you gave him hope. I've been so afraid of the past that I forgot how to live in the present." Amara smiled faintly. "Sometimes the only way to heal is to forgive what broke us." Silence filled the room again, not heavy, but peaceful. After she carried Ethan to bed, she turned to leave, but Alexander stopped her at the door. "Stay," he said softly. "Not as a maid, as someone who belongs here." Her breath caught. She looked into his eyes, searching for the man she once thought cold and unreachable. What she saw now was different, vulnerable, human, sincere. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "Just know that this house will always have a place for you." The next morning, the sun rose clear and warm. Birds chirped over the garden that Amara used to water each dawn. She walked outside and felt the light on her face, closing her eyes for a moment. She could hear Ethan laughing with the housekeeper, the sound carrying through the open doors. It felt like life had returned. Alexander watched her from the balcony above. He was no longer the man who commanded the world through fear and money. He was simply a friar, a man learning to live again. That afternoon, he found Amara sitting under the oak tree, reading a children's book. Ethan lay beside her, half asleep. Alexander sat down nearby, the grass damp beneath his hands. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked after a long silence. She looked up at him, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I look at him and I can't." He nodded slowly. "If you ever choose to promise me you'll take something with you." She tilted her head. "What?" He smiled faintly. "The knowledge that you changed 2 lives." Her eyes glistened. "You changed too, Mr. Grant." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "Just Alexander." The way she said his name after that felt like the beginning of something unspoken, fragile and real. In the following weeks, Amara stayed to help Ethan with his speech therapy. Each day the boy spoke clearer, stronger. Sometimes when she laughed, Alexander caught himself watching her a little too long. One evening after Ethan had gone to bed, he found her in the kitchen washing dishes. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've done enough for one day." She smiled without turning. "I like it. It reminds me I'm still useful." He stepped closer, hesitant. "You've been more than useful. You've been necessary." She looked up at him, and for a moment neither moved. The clock ticked softly in the background. He cleared his throat, stepping back slightly. "There's something I want to show you tomorrow," he said. "Come with me after breakfast." The next morning he drove her and Ethan to a quiet field just outside the city. The grass waved gently in the wind, and in the middle stood a small half-renovated cottage. "What is this place?" Amara asked. Alexander handed her a small set of keys. "You told me once that every child deserves to smile. I bought this place for that purpose. I want to turn it into a home for children who have lost theirs." Amara stared at him, speechless. "You mean an orphanage?" He nodded. "A place filled with warmth, not money. I'll fund it, but I want you to run it. No contracts, no conditions, just heart." Her eyes welled up. "Why me?" "Because you already saved one child," he said, looking down at Ethan, who was chasing butterflies across the grass. "Maybe together we can save more." For a long time she said nothing. Then she reached for the keys, her hand trembling. "If this is what you truly want, then yes, I'll do it." Alexander smiled, and for the first time his smile reached his eyes. Months passed, and the cottage slowly transformed. Children began to fill it with laughter and life. The locals called it the House of Second Chances. Alexander visited often, helping build swings and plant flowers. Amara managed everything with grace and patience, her warmth touching every corner. Ethan ran through the halls playing with the other children, no longer silent or afraid. One evening as the sun dipped low, Alexander found Amara standing on the porch, watching the children chase fireflies. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "They're happy," she replied. "That's all I ever wanted." He stepped beside her, folding his hands. "You know, I thought wealth meant control. I spent years building walls to protect myself. But you tore them down with kindness." She turned to him, her expression tender. "Kindness isn't weakness, Alexander. It's courage." He nodded, eyes glistening. "You taught me that." The sound of laughter floated through the air, blending with the soft hum of evening insects. He looked at her, the fading sunlight catching in her hair. "Do you ever regret coming to work for me?" She smiled gently. "If I hadn't, Ethan would still be lost. And you, maybe you'd still be alone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden crane, Ethan's favorite toy, the one she had folded long ago. "I kept this," he said, "to remind me that even broken things can fly again." Tears filled her eyes. "That crane was for hope," she whispered. "Then it belongs to both of us," he said, placing it gently in her palm. For a long moment they stood in silence, surrounded by the laughter of children and the fading light. Later that night, when he returned to the mansion, he found himself standing before a framed photo of his late wife. He whispered, "I finally understand what you meant when you said, 'Love isn't something you own. It's something you give.'" The wind outside carried the faint echo of children's laughter from the cottage miles away. And for once, it didn't sound distant. It sounded like home. Months later, on the anniversary of the accident, the three of them, Alexander, Amara, and Ethan, stood together at the same field. The grass was green again, the sky bright and endless. Ethan handed Amara a small paper crane he had folded himself. "For you," he said proudly. She smiled, tears glistening. It's perfect. Alexander rested a hand on his son's shoulder. You've come a long way, he said softly. We all have, Amara replied. They looked at each other, a quiet understanding passing between them. No words were needed. The camera of memory would fade slowly on that image, the boy's laughter, the woman's gentle smile, the man's peaceful gaze. And in that silence, the voice of the storyteller would return low and warm, saying, Sometimes the richest hearts are not the ones born into wealth, but the ones that learn how to give it away. Money can build houses, but only love can build a home. So if this story touched your heart, don't forget to stay to listen to remember that kindness is never forgotten. Somewhere in the world, another heart is waiting for a smile just like yours. Subscribe for more stories that remind us that love, forgiveness, and humanity are the greatest treasures of all. And as the final notes of soft piano music fade, the image of the house filled with laughter glows under the golden light, a testament to what happens when pain turns to compassion and when strangers become family.